I also want to express our sympathy and solidarity with the family and friends of Noel Whelan and Brendan Grace. Taoiseach, there are over 2,000 children right now in US migrant detention centres. They're separated from their parents. They're crammed together in massively overcrowded warehouses. In many cases, they're held for weeks in extremely cold temperatures, with lights on 24 hours a day, with no adequate access to medical care, to sanitation, to soap, to water, or adequate food. It is the grossest, most inhumane, most depraved expression of Trump's anti-immigrant racist policies. These centres meet the definition of concentration camps. They are mass incarceration of people, in this case children, without trial. A lawyer recently inspected a facility in Texas and said the following: "The children were filthy dirty. There was mucus on their shirts. The shirts were dirty. We saw breast milk on the shirts. There was food on the shirts and the pants as well. They told us that they were hungry. They told us that some of them had not showered at all or had not showered until the day or two before we arrived. Many of them described that they had only brushed their teeth once. The guards are asking the younger children or the older children, who wants to take care of this little boy? Who wants to take care of this little girl? And they'll bring in a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old. And then the littlest kids are expected to be taken care of by the older kids, but then some of the older children lose interest in it and little children get handed off to other children. And sometimes we hear about the littlest children being alone by themselves on the floor." That was a pre-announced visit. One can only imagine the circumstances where there is no pre-warning of a visit. It's absolutely heartbreaking stuff, and it isn't an accident. It's being done extremely consciously by the Trump administration, and they're open about it, to discourage asylum seekers from coming to the US. The conditions that those people are fleeing in countries in Central America include vicious narcotics gangs, collapsed economies, and ecological disaster. They are, to a very large degree, the result of the policies of the US, which has ruthlessly dominated that region for 150 years. That includes dozens of military interventions, support for military coups, and the implementation of the so-called Free Trade Agreement, CAFTA. There's a growing movement of protests targeted against these migrant detention camps. You have people like Megan Rapinoe, the US soccer captain, speaking out against the message that excludes people from Donald Trump. And most powerfully recently, you have US workers at the Wayfair Furniture Company taking the lead by walking off the job because their company refused to stop doing business with these for-profit detention camps. That's what solidarity looks like. They're the steps that are needed to shut down the camps and take down Trump. But the question for you, Taoiseach, is what's the government going to do about it? 1 year ago, we passed a motion unanimously in the Dáil describing this treatment as inhumane, undignified and unwarranted, and called for it to be reversed immediately. But what has been done by the government? How have you spoken out about it? Was it raised with Donald Trump by the Taoiseach, or was he able to come to Ireland to play a game of golf, being responsible for these conditions at home, which include the death of 7 children in the care, so-called, of the US immigration agencies? Will Mike Pence be able to do the same in September? Will the government continue with mild hand-wringing and criticism when they're not here, but grovelling subservience when you actually meet with the US administration?
Well, Deputy, first of all, can I say that that the images that we see from some of the detention centres on the southern borders of the US make for very uncomfortable watching. When refugees and asylum seekers cross a border, there are international standards that should be expected and delivered, particularly in terms of the protection of children. Can I say, though, that the migration challenges and the suffering of children is not solely confined to the camps that we see in the US. And I think the European Union also needs to take a look at itself in relation to questions around migration, not just the need for generosity, towards people who are fleeing from conflict, but also the international standards and obligations that should be adopted. Today, globally, there are over 70 million people who are either refugees, displaced or asylum seekers. It's an enormous number, and Ireland, I hope, is trying to give some leadership in terms of how integration can work as regards migration, even though we deal with much smaller numbers than many other countries. But the collective challenge for the European Union in terms of migration is one that we need to focus ourselves on, as well as offer constructive criticism to how other countries manage migration as well. I don't want to shy away from it. As have others, I have been concerned and critical of border management on the southern border of the US. Nobody wants to see children separated from parents. They shouldn't be. And this is the source of a significant debate on Capitol Hill, particularly in the US Congress, and of course differences of opinion. But I do think that the European Union and its member states need to take a look at how we as a collective deal with the migration challenge, as well as offer criticisms and observations abroad.
Supplementary of 1 minute.
Are you going to voice those criticisms to Mike Pence when he's here in September? Did the Taoiseach raise any of those criticisms with Donald Trump when he was here, a couple of months ago? I mean, the conditions are just absolutely obscene. They're horrific. I think they're well beyond the bounds whereby what's needed is like some constructive criticism. We need clear condemnation by the government of the actions of Donald Trump and the US administration. That's what we need as part of building international pressure, because this is going to get worse. I mean, when we passed the motion a year ago, it wasn't as bad. There weren't as many children affected, and the conditions weren't as bad as it is now. They've gotten worse and worse and worse, and they will continue to, unless there's a movement, particularly in the US, but also elsewhere. But I would also agree with you in the sense that the EU needs to look at itself, because the EU is not a paragon of virtue. The EU outsources its dirty work, and the government agrees with that. You know, the government agrees with the deal with Turkey to give Turkey €6 billion to have the migrant camps in Turkey rather than the EU. The government agrees with the externalisation of migrant policy by the EU, which means that these camps are set up, for example, in North Africa. They agree, broadly speaking, with the Fortress Europe policy, which has seen 10,000 migrants die in the Mediterranean since 2015. Or even in terms of Ireland, and Ireland being a leader. If you think Ireland needs to look, you know,
Deputy,
EU, just a question, shut down direct provision. 6,000 people are in direct provision in Ireland, also in for-profit camps.
Deputy, you've raised a whole load of issues there that I would like to have time to respond to, but I don't. I accept that, and I'll be within the minute. I think this House made its views clear in relation to the separation of children in the context of migration and refugees, and that position hasn't changed. I'm not aware of everything that was raised by the Taoiseach with President Trump, but I certainly hope to have an opportunity to meet Vice President Mike Pence when he visits Ireland later on in the summer. But in the context of EU policy on migration, I think it'll be one of the big challenges, actually, for the next 5 years, both for the European Parliament and indeed for the Commission and European Council. We do need to partner with neighbouring countries in terms of trying to manage migration in a way that doesn't see an increase in the rise of the far right and anti-immigrant sentiment, and trying to provide practical political solutions that are also generous and humane in terms of how migration is managed is, I think, one of the big challenges that certainly Ireland wants to be part of a discussion on.